Curse of Gold and Beauty, a Rumpelstiltskin retelling by Mary Mecham, narrated by Tawnya Rollingson. Chapter 1. I thought I would find you here. Rhys's pale face crested Outlook Rock, the flat slab that sat atop the hill I was lying on. He and I spent many afternoons sitting together on that rock, staring out over our tiny village of Tyrone. The sun bathed my face in a warm glow as I sank back down on the grassy knoll and closed my eyes. You always know where to find me, you stalker. Are you sure your gift isn't mind-reading? I felt Rhys lie down next to me. Nah, I'm not brave enough to want to know what is going on inside anyone else's head. People scare me enough as it is. Despite the dreadful morning I had already endured, a smile lifted my lips. That is probably a good choice. My thoughts aren't all that kind right now. Another suitor parade? Yep. 6 rich old men, all offering to buy me like an animal at auction, each one more foul than the last. At least Papa didn't order me to stay. You would think that he would have caught on by now that you are forced to do whatever he says. Stupid curse. Most people would assume that being blessed with unparalleled beauty would be a cause for celebration. My papa had certainly thought so when the fairy of the Darkwood Mountain explained what she had in mind for my blessing. Having a gift bestowed was rare, particularly for commoners, and Papa had no way of knowing that the fairy's supposed gift came with a heavy price. All that my beauty cost me was an unwavering obedience to my father. At least I can find loopholes when it isn't in order. Rhys grinned at me. You are very sneaky that way. Is that why you are out here hiding? I smirked. He never said I had to stay to entertain the suitors, just to put on a nice dress and be prepared for visitors. I am prepared, and look, here you are, visiting me. Rhys laughed and tugged at the lace peeking out by my shoulders. So much cunning and shrewdness hidden under that facade of perfection. Being cunning and shrewd is perfection. I've managed to evade getting married this far. I wish you would just tell him, Meg. I felt the intensity of Rhys's gaze and turned my head to look at him. You know I would if I could. Papa was a good man, and I knew he loved me. But he was naive. He never even suspected that my gift had been accompanied by a curse, and he delightedly told everyone he knew about his talented, obedient, beautiful daughter. Rhys was the only one who had managed to figure out the truth, as I was unable to tell anyone about my curse. Just as happened each time Papa told me to not complain or to refrain from contradicting him, any time I wanted to tell anyone about my curse, my tongue would swell and stick to the top of my mouth, making speech impossible. Rhys's gaze didn't drop. I know, but if you don't find a way to let him know soon, you will end up married off to someone you hate. I hate all of them, I responded without hesitation. It was true. I didn't want to marry some fabulously wealthy old widower who wanted a show dog to parade around on his arm, a silent trophy to flaunt to his slimy friends and admirers. At least I wasn't forced to obey anyone who opened their mouth. Just Papa. I closed my eyes again and relished the warmth of the afternoon. At least I had Rhys on my side. Without him, life would be miserable. Rhys was trying to alternately make a fist and stretch out his fingers, which were always stiff, swollen, and sore, particularly in the mornings. He grimaced when he saw me watching. Not too bad today. I rolled my eyes. You say that every day. Rhys was a rotten liar. I could always tell when his hands were hurting him, and it was most of the time. I looked down at his fingers, raised nodules scattered across his knuckles and wrists. I allowed my gaze to lift and trail up to his elbows, where more bumps stood out. His skin was the palest shade of white I had ever seen on anyone from the extended time he spent indoors. His chronic fatigue and frequent bouts of illness would have been bad enough, but with all he was forced to do for his adoptive mother on top of that, anger bubbled in my gut just thinking about it. He shrugged and continued his stretching exercises, placidly flexing his fingers back and forth. Each day can be a challenge, but it is also a gift. A warm glow that had nothing to do with the weather filled my body. This was something I absolutely adored about Rhys. His unfailing optimism, even when his body refused to perform the task that was instructed. I wished I could find the positivity with which he approached every day. He could always find something to be cheerful about. A raspy, screeching voice came floating up over the hill.
Boy! Boy, where are you?
I looked over at Rhys, who grimaced.
It's that time again. Come see me soon and keep me company, okay? You aren't the only one having a rotten day.
He convulsively clenched his hands, knowing the abuse they were about to endure. We can go together now, I said quickly, propping myself up on my elbow. Not like I want to go back home anytime soon. The suitors are probably still in negotiations with Papa. Rhys heaved himself onto his feet and offered me a hand. I let him pull me up and followed him back down to the village. I ducked under the low doorframe of Mildred's house. If Rhys wasn't my best friend, I would give this dilapidated hut the widest berth possible, or else petition to have it burned to the ground. The hovel stank of goats and sour milk, and I hated it there. Clutter and piles of garbage were heaped everywhere, and pebbled goat droppings piled in clusters. Yet Rhys wended his way skillfully through the debris, following a path he clearly knew well. Only by following his footsteps carefully was I able to avoid tumbling into the masses of rubbish, and I delicately held the hem of my skirts off the grimy floor.
I will trade you this,
Mildred offered with a leer, handing Rhys a tiny thread of spun gold.
In return for spinning this.
She pointed to a heap of straw. I clenched my jaw as I glared at the short woman, whose brunette hair was beginning to show streaks of gray. If I didn't know how despicable she truly was, I might have considered her pretty. Besides one venomous glance through slitted, mistrustful eyes before she shut the door to his workroom with a snap, she ignored me completely. I knew full well that it was only because of my absolute silence about Rhys's abilities that Mildred tolerated my presence at all. Compelled into action by Mildred's offer to trade, Rhys sat at the spinning wheel that he detested so much and reached for a handful of straw that lay at his feet in a mound as large as a young calf. The familiar whirring started as Rhys pumped the treadle and began to feed the straw into the spinning wheel. The empty spool on the spindle began to whirl around in time with the wheel, and soon the spun thread wound around the revolving spool, filling it with gleaming metallic golden thread.
Well, Meg, it looks like it is time for another club meeting,
he observed with a grin, hands never ceasing in their work, and foot never pausing in its pumping of the treadle. When we were younger and discovered each other's abilities, we created a secret club only for people who had been cursed and had regularly held meetings for almost 10 years. We were the only 2 members. I laughed and pulled up a stool on the opposite side of the spinning wheel. I invariably appointed myself Rhys's helper and would move each spool plump with gold thread to the wicker basket and replace it with an empty one. For all my complaints about my own curse, I really didn't have that much to grumble about. Yes, I had to obey any direct order from Papa, but at least he meant well and wanted what was best for me, and I remained free to ignore anything that wasn't a direct order. Rhys, however, I shuddered to think about his grim childhood. He had been orphaned at 4 years old. When the fairy of the Darkwood Mountains saw him wandering the streets, she took pity on him and brought him to Mildred. The way Rhys told it, the fairy told her that in exchange for her raising the child, she would never lack for gold again. Of course, greedy Mildred had readily accepted. The fairy secretly blessed Rhys with the ability to spin straw into gold, but just like mine, the gift came with an accompanying curse. Rhys was incapable of refusing to spin any time someone offered a trade for his services, so long as what the other person offered was of value to them. and he was forced to continue until his allotted straw was depleted. The caveat was that what was of value to one person might be worthless to Rhys, as evidenced by Mildred's daily bargain. She valued gold and would regularly trade him back a single strand of his own gold in exchange for several spools more. The worst part was that because Mildred valued each strand of gold, Rhys was forced to accept the trade each time and spin every day for hours, no matter how much it hurt him to do so, and couldn't take back what he had rightfully spun. Any time he thought of stealing enough to run away and start a new life, his feet would become stuck to the floor, just like how my tongue would become stuck to the roof of my mouth when I tried to disobey my father. I hated the sight of the spindles fat with gold thread. Blood money, we called it, and rightfully so. I often daydreamed of stealing the gold that Rhys could not, and running away with him, far away from Mildred so he could begin life anew. But such fantasies were just that, fantasies. Mildred had each spool counted 100 times over. With Rhys's inability to run long distances, I knew we would never make it far before Mildred called upon the king's guards to fetch us back. With his constantly fluctuating levels of health, he would never manage to make it far without some gold, and selfishly, I wanted him to stay with me. As I looked down at Rhys's hands, I saw that his palms and fingers were bleeding again, slit open from the sharp metallic thread that ripped across his palms as the straw transformed. When the last bit of straw had been turned into gold, and the wheel whirred to a stop, I gently took his hands into mine and examined them closely. There were slivers visible all throughout his hands, which were becoming inflamed and swollen. Flecks of straw and gold were caked under his fingernails, jammed down so deep that the sensitive skin under his nails had turned bright red. I ran my fingers lightly along the ribbons of uninjured skin. There wasn't much. Any time Rhys wore gloves, the magic wouldn't work, and his curse compelled him to spin when bargained with. Dried blood was crusted all along the heavy calluses on his hands, tribute to the daily torture Mildred forced him into. I clenched my jaw shut. If only his adoptive mother cared about him more than his ability to spin straw into gold. What was it to her if Rhys's hands were blistered and bleeding, as long as she increased her wealth each day? Her plan was to move across the kingdom and purchase a large manor with servants and carriages. But golden thread was too suspicious of an item to have. She was waiting to collect enough thread to melt the entire lot into thousands of coins. In the meantime, Mildred jealously hoarded each strand of gold, forcing Rhys to live in squalor and listen to her ranting all of her crazy conspiracy theories. Once she had her fancy manor, it was only a matter of time before she lived like a queen, while keeping Rhys in the basement, spinning every day to sustain a ridiculous lifestyle. It made me sick. The worst part of the aftermath of Rhys's spinning was picking out the splinters of straw and gold that wedged themselves into his flesh. His eyelid twitched ever so slightly as I used my nails to dig out a particularly deep splinter, and his jaw tightened. Perhaps part of Rhys's gift was his ability to conceal just how much pain he was constantly in. It was only because I knew him so well that I managed to pick up on his pain. I picked up the shallow dish of the healing tonic I made every week and kept stored in Rhys's workroom.
I hereby call this Club for the Cursed meeting to order, I said, and dabbed gingerly at Rhys's injured hands.
And what shall we discuss today? It seems that last week we went on about the woes of our curses until the wee hours of the morning. Your father was arranging a search party when you got back.
I continued to apply the tonic to Rhys's hands as softly as I could. I could tell he was looking at me, but I kept my eyes on his wounds. Lately, I had been finding it more and more difficult to look away when we made eye contact, and kept finding excuses to extend my visits with him. The only good part of Rhys's terrible curse was that it regularly gave me justification to hold his hand while I applied the tonic in slow, sweeping strokes. Papa remained unaware of the hours I spent with Rhys. I knew he would disapprove if he found out, and if he banned me from seeing Rhys again, I wouldn't be able to bear it.
Papa wanted an advantageous marriage for me, so I couldn't let him know about the intense feelings I had harbored for a penniless orphan boy for years. Nor could I tell Rhys. If he didn't return my feelings, our friendship would be ruined, and I couldn't survive losing him.
I have quite a bit to say about Mildred, I said spitefully. We could discuss her, or we could revisit the theme of how to free ourselves from our curses. Because that would be such a new topic. We've only talked about that at every meeting we've ever had, Rhys chortled, his sandy blonde hair flopping down into his brown eyes. Outwardly, nothing in his physical appearance would strike an outsider as remarkable. He was an average height, his nose was crooked from being broken in a fight years before, and he was somewhat duck-footed when he walked. The other boys in town mocked Rhys's pale face, untanned since he was so rarely allowed to go outside, and they frequently picked on him. The village girls told me I was silly for wasting my time with someone as common as he when I was so beautiful. But I didn't care what they thought in the slightest. The time I spent with Rhys was always the highlight of my day. He saw me, not just my outward appearance. I carefully dried Rhys's hands and began winding bandages around them, taking care to bind his hand to staunch the bleeding, and also support his joints to lessen his pain. He held up his covered hands. Very nice. Everyone will think I am in a fight club. This will improve my reputation immensely.
Mildred shuffled in at that point and began dragging the basket of gold out of the room. She wasn't bad-looking if you didn't know her, and was only 10 to 15 years older than myself and Rhys, but her sour attitude made her seem much older. She sniffed as she looked at the dressings on his hands, blood already starting to stain through the thin linen. She caught Rhys flinch as I tied a knot to keep the bandages in place.
Oh, stop it, boy. Other people have it much worse than you.
I glared at Mildred. Whether others were in more pain was irrelevant. Rhys's pain was every bit as valid. I hated her complete disregard for his well-being. As much as I wanted to give his so-called mother a severe tongue-lashing, I knew that if I so much as said a word against her, she might tell Papa where I had been. Mildred wasn't stupid. She knew of the secrecy of my visits, even if she wasn't aware of the implications of my curse. Papa had expressed the wish for me to associate with high society, but as it was not an order, I was free to fulfill his wishes in any way I did or didn't see fit. If Papa realized where I spent the majority of my time, he was likely to tell me to not spend time with Rhys, and I would be forced to obey.
Until tomorrow, boy, Mildred snapped. Be sure to get the washing done, too.
Once again, I was ignored completely. I waited until she was out of earshot before whispering to Rhys, "You sure you don't want to gossip about her for our meeting today?" Rhys snickered and rolled the single strand of gold Mildred had traded for the basketful before tucking it into his threadbare vest pocket. Despite his continual assertion that he hated all the gold he spun, I had noticed that he held tightly to the few strands he was traded back each week. He was wildly secretive about it any time I questioned him, and I suspected that he was merely doing it to make me suspicious. He loved teasing me like that, and I was determined not to give him the satisfaction of prying into his mystery.
How about, if you hadn't been cursed, what do you think your life would be like? He asked.
I wouldn't have to look for loopholes in everything Papa said.
Maybe you still would. You would be an excellent lawyer.
I grinned and pushed on his shoulder. I wasn't done. I would talk back to Papa any time I chose, and would flatly refuse to be paraded around like a prize horse for sale in front of wealthy widowers.
You already manage to refuse half the time.
But evading and refusing are not the same thing. I waggled my finger at Rhys. Just because I escaped this time doesn't mean Papa won't give a different order next time that forces me to stay. What about you? Rhys looked around his dingy room, reeking of goat dung in mock surprise.
Don't I already have everything someone could wish for?
Then he stretched and interlocked his bandaged fingers behind his head.
Let's see. I would burn every spinning wheel in the kingdom and convince King Drupert to issue a royal proclamation to ban straw forever. My hands wouldn't be so scarred. He held out his bandaged hands. So I think I might like to take up a musical instrument. Although I may have starved to death as a child if I hadn't been given the gift that made Mildred want to keep me. So all in all, I don't have it so bad.
Papa and I would have taken you in. Rhys laughed and tucked one of the loose locks of blonde hair falling into my face behind my ear.
As you were a baby at the time, I don't think you would have been too convincing.
Babies are very persuasive, I informed Rhys solemnly. Especially the chubby, uncursed ones, which I would have been at the time.
Ah, yes. It seems my opinions are influenced daily by them.
I rolled my eyes, but couldn't help smiling. I loved babies. I loved their soft, pudgy thighs and dimpled hands. I loved the way they smelled and the way their eyes nearly disappeared when their fat cheeks rose in a nose-wrinkling smile. Every time I saw an infant, I felt a pang of longing. Papa's dearest ambition was to secure a rich husband for me, but the men he introduced me to were inevitably many years my senior, who leered unpleasantly at me and made comments about what an excellent investment I would be. I couldn't imagine having children with any of them. What would you do instead of spin gold?
Open an orphanage,
came Rhys's instant reply. Then he grinned at me.
Just think, babies galore.
My heart melted. Rhys constantly watched out for others, and it was one of the many things I admired about him. He was intelligent enough that he could do anything, absolutely anything, I was sure of it. But with all his intelligence and talents, he wanted to open an orphanage so other young children didn't suffer like he had. I covered his hand with mine. Rhys, you are amazing.
Nah, just a big softy. Not very manly, I know.
You are the best man I know. My face tinged pink. I continually had to remind myself to not flirt with Rhys and give away my feelings for him, but it was nearly impossible to keep my distance when I was around him. There always seemed to be a perfectly logical reason as to why I should take his hand or brush something off his shoulder, and it flooded me with giddy delight each time. I wished I had been blessed with the ability to read minds. I would have been able to probe Rhys's thoughts and see if he felt the same way about me. I often wondered if he did. Occasionally, his gaze would linger a little longer than was usual for friends, or else his hand would nudge mine while we were walking. But every time, the moment passed so quickly, I was left to wonder if I'd imagined it all. Every time we found time to be alone together, I found it more and more difficult to tear myself away. Even now, huddled next to each other in a smelly, dimly lit back room, I felt my body's temperature rising just from being near Rhys. "Want to get some fresh air?" I needed to get out before either the smell of goats or my desire to confess my feelings overpowered me. Rhys and I stood at the same time, but he didn't move toward the door.
"When do you need to get back?"
he asked. I twitched my mouth to the side. "By dusk, probably. Negotiations are usually finished by then. Papa hasn't accepted any offers yet, so I am hoping the trend will continue until there are no men left. I'm not interested in any of them. They only care that I'm beautiful." I spat the last word out like a foul oath. Rhys's face twisted into an expression I couldn't read. Twice he opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out. When he found his voice again, he simply said,
"Meg, I hope that you marry someone who sees you for who you really are. You deserve happiness."
My heart sank. I kept secretly hoping that Rhys would voice his own attraction to me, but he either didn't have those feelings or he suppressed them, just as I did around him. I glanced out of the grimy window. The sun was starting to sink.
"I can walk you home,"
Rhys offered. I hid the smile that threatened to emerge and merely nodded. Mildred was seated at the filthy kitchen table as we left, but she didn't even look up as Rhys and I walked out the door. and we didn't bid her farewell. Our steps crunched on the pebbled path under our feet as we wound our way away from Reese's side of town. The street bustled with shopkeepers hurrying home for the day, sweethearts walking hand in hand, and small children shouting as they chased each other. I continued to ask Reese about the orphanage he wanted to open. It was easy to imagine Reese surrounded by children who all wanted his attention, teaching them how to plant a garden or darn a sock. Mildred never did chores around their house. It was always up to Reese, who was just as knowledgeable about such tasks as any housewife. For my part, I wished Papa was more willing to let me help, but in his usual doting manner, he refused to let me lift a finger for work.
"How are harp lessons going?"
Reese asked. I pulled a face. You know my musical abilities, or woeful lack thereof. It doesn't matter who Papa hires to teach me, I just can't replicate anything my instructors play. They make it look so easy, but I get all fumble-fingered.
Reese laughed. "Same. The only thing standing between me and becoming a world-famous musician, other than this," he lifted his bandaged hands, "is any semblance of musical talent."
"I know that. You sang for me once, remember?" I teased, nudging my elbow into his side. He closed his eyes at the memory.
"Ah, yes. It seems that my dreadful singing was only slightly better than yours."
I rolled my eyes. It was so refreshing to have someone around who would tease me about my deficiencies. All too often, people would offer innumerable compliments, but their comments always felt hollow and empty to me. Nobody ever saw more than a pretty face. I hated being seen as a mere ornament, something to be polished and displayed in a window, but with no purpose. The tavern's windows glowed against the darkening sky, and a scrum of men were just visible crowding around the bar inside. Before we passed the open door, Reese inconspicuously moved to my other side, quietly shielding me from view of the tavern-goers. I heaved an immense sigh of relief. I hated being called out to by drunkards, as inevitably happened when I passed the tavern alone. "Thank you," I mouthed to Reese as we passed. He pulled his gaze away from where he had been reading my lips.
"I'm happy to."
He walked a little more slowly than I did, and I matched his pace. Quite often he became fatigued with too much exertion, and I didn't want him to feel like he was slowing me down. I was in no hurry to rush home anyway. We reached my house in all too short of a time. I had expected that all of the suitors would be gone, but when the house came into view, I spotted an unfamiliar coach and team of horses still tied outside. My heart plummeted. What if tonight was the night Papa had finally accepted one of the offers? I dreaded what I would find. Reese noticed the sudden drag in my step and followed my line of sight.
"I can talk to your father," he offered. "You may not be able to tell him, but I could try again."
I suppose if Papa forced me to get engaged to someone I didn't want, I could just run away, I suggested dully.
"And go where?"
"Anywhere. I don't want to be shackled to some old codger who thinks I'm just another feather in his hat." I stopped walking completely, still staring at the mill and the tiny house attached. I tried to imagine a life without Papa or Reese, but my brain couldn't process the possibility. I turned to Reese. "Have you ever thought about running away from Mildred?"
"Many times."
"What stopped you?" Reese didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was light and casual.
"I guess I like my life here too much. Besides, I wouldn't have the money to start a new life somewhere else, and don't really have any skills to support myself."
His hands convulsed into fists. I contemplated. Running away wasn't such a bad idea to escape an unwanted marriage. But I did love Papa, and I couldn't bear the thought of never seeing Reese again. Same. Reese scuffed his toe against the ground.
"If you ever did decide to run away, I could help you."
I smiled. "And how would you do that?"
"You could bargain with me to spin straw, and that would give you—"
"Don't even think about finishing that sentence. I will never contribute to your curse, do you hear me? Never!"
Reese grinned. Only you and Mildred know about my curse. Yet you have never once asked me to spin for you. I think you are the only person in the world not tempted by unlimited gold."
I smiled back. "And you are the only person in the world who sees me for more than what I look like." Rhys's grin faded as he stared at the coach and team tethered outside.
"One day you may want to get into one of those fancy coaches," he said, barely audible. "Just make sure you say goodbye before you do."
I frowned. "You just said that I don't care about unlimited riches. Now you say I am going to get moon eyes over some velvety seat while I stare at some horse's backside? No, thank you. I would rather sit next to you on a pumpkin than be ogled on a velvet cushion." Rhys blushed. The distant sound of a door opening met my ears. It was Papa coming out to check where I was. I resisted the urge to shrink behind Rhys, but I knew my skirts would give me away the second Papa looked this way. Papa spotted me, waved me over, then disappeared back into the house.
"Worried?"
Rhys asked. I squared my shoulders and held my head high. "Not in the slightest. I still have a few tricks when it comes to driving off suitors." I flashed a smile. "How do you think I have stayed unmarried this long?"